Coming up, one SEC assistant social media rant's getting a lot of attention, and another SEC head coach has gone from brand new hire to hot seat, apparently pretty quickly. We'll talk about it all next, right here on SEC Country Live. Hello, everybody. Welcome into SEC Country Live. I am Brandon Adams. Happy to have you with us here today as we go through all the news from around the Southeastern Conference, and we take your comments on both Facebook and YouTube. We'll look forward to doing that with you here today. Very interesting rant over the course of the last 24 hours from an SEC assistant coach, Antonio Cromartie, the cornerbacks coach at Texas A&M. You know him as not only a former NFL defensive back, also a very prolific procreator there as well, but that's a different topic for a different day. But Cromartie on social media apparently a little frustrated with some of the chatter that he sees happening around the world of name, image, likeness revenue right now. Now, this is obviously interesting because Texas A&M has been a big part of the offseason chatter related to NIL, and while it's not exactly clear of what Cromartie is specifically referencing here, it is certainly interesting given everything else everybody's been saying about the Aggies as of late. So let me read you these tweets from Cromartie, and we'll talk about how this factors into another conversation that's been ongoing with Texas A&M here this year. So here's what Antonio Cromartie says on Twitter. This is 18 hours ago. Man, this NIL deal-ish is crazy, he says. Now kids are worried about everybody else's pockets. How about this? Worry about taking care of things on the field first, and everything else will follow. Because if you're not productive on the field or in the class, you won't see the money. Worry about you. He goes on to say, and I hope with everyone's family looking for a big payday from these NIL deals, they're also getting financial education, he says. If y'all are paying these marketing companies 25 to 30% and then getting taxed at 36%, just know you're not making any money, he says, which, by the way, is to a degree true. He says that's over 50% of your money gone right there. And then he says, and just know these marketing agents want their money before the taxes, just like the government does. So I think Antonio Cromartie, in some sense, is probably saying some true things there. But for a lot of other people, this kind of factors into a long offseason conversation about just how much name, image, likeness money Texas A&M has thrown around to get what is the number one class in the country, not disputed, but also maybe the highest rated class of all time based on how it finishes it up and who's truly in there and kind of which of these rating services that you care the most about. This is a historically good recruiting class for Texas A&M, and it has been believed by many to be aided by the new name, image, likeness laws that are in place in some states, Texas included, and the landscape of which has become a part of the college football conversation here over the course of the last year. So, in fact, if you want to go back to December here for a moment, when the early signing period began, Jimbo Fisher did not shy away from the notion that name, image, likeness, the chance for players to make money and some revenue off their fame, is not the kind of thing that Texas A&M is going to shy away from doing when it comes to trying to bring players in the program. This is Fisher going back to December.
You can't promise things. You can't say, I'm going to get you an NIL deal, and that's illegal. I mean, all you can do is present what other players in your university have done in the past. That is all you're allowed to do. But there was a lot of NIL deals going on before all this was going on. They just weren't legal. No one told nobody. I mean, all that stuff in college. Now, we're part of it, but at the same time, that's where you're at in today's time. At least it makes it out there, and it is legal, and the guys can get compensated. But I think it's enticing in recruiting. I think it's very dangerous in that way. But I mean, you got to enforce the rules when they're broken. You got to handle that part of it.
So that's Jimbo Fisher acknowledging that Texas A&M wants to be a player when it comes to name, image, likeness opportunities for its players. But he doesn't really get much more specific than that. What has also been kind of amazing and maybe made more interesting by the rant on Twitter by Aggies assistant Antonio Cromartie that we read for you a moment ago is one rumor in particular that remains fairly persistent about Texas A&M. And I guess the origin for this was an Oklahoma message board, and if you search Texas A&M name, image, likeness, which I did and just in getting ready for the show, everything seems to reference back to a post at an Oklahoma message board. You've had August journalistic bodies like Bro Bible writing about this, for instance. But the whole deal here is there was a guy on Twitter who just simply goes by Spicoli with some underscores behind that, and he shows a screenshot from a 24/7 sports message board where an Oklahoma booster goes on that message board and says about Texas A&M that the number that he's heard is that Texas A&M boosters have committed $25 to $30 million towards this 2022 signing class. And he says, we're nowhere near prepared to dish out that kind of money. He says A&M's donors were extremely coordinated. The coaching staff would identify players they wanted, relay those to the point donor, and then that individual would work with various other donors to build an LLC that would sponsor the targeted player. And if you're hoping they'll just jump in the portal after year one, he goes on to say there's basically some contract parameters to prevent that from happening. So it is amazing to me how much attention this one message board post has gotten. As I said before, a lot of the online chatter, blog posts, things like that, about what Texas A&M has done from a name, image, likeness standpoint, all in some form or fashion reference back to this social media, I should say this message board post from this purported booster to the Oklahoma program. And listen, in 2022, the average college football fan, especially the one that's watching a show like this, is actually fairly savvy. Most college football fans that are pretty well versed in media know the difference between like random message board poster and actual published report from a guy who's putting his reputation on the line based on what he's saying there. Most college football fans who are watching a show like this or trafficking in message boards, they kind of know the difference. And to me, this feels an awful lot more like message board post than it does actual news report, but it's been pretty remarkable to watch the way in which this has traveled around and become such a prominent deal that Ross Bjork, who's the Texas A&M athletic director, you remember him used to be at Ole Miss, now he's at Texas A&M. There was a recent Houston Chronicle story where he's basically asked about this. Hey, Brent Zwerneman, who does a good job, Zwerneman's the guy who broke the OU Texas to the SEC news back in July at SEC Media Days. So he goes directly to Ross Bjork and says, hey, the word on the street is y'all are paying $25, $30 million for your 2022 signing class. In that story at the Houston Chronicle, Bjork denies that's true, essentially saying that makes it sound like Jimbo Fisher and this recruiting staff haven't done a good job. They're just simply relying on NIL, and he says that's simply not true. And in the interview with Houston Chronicle, he goes on to cite the previous recruiting success they've had in the previous years before that as a way of saying, of course, it's ridiculous that we're now throwing this kind of money around. We were already recruiting well even before NIL, is basically a paraphrase of what Ross Bjork tells the Houston Chronicle. So the point I'm getting to is all of this I find to be really confusing. And a lot of times on a show like this, I will come on here and I'll tell you what I think about some hot topic. I'll at least pretend to know exactly what I'm saying, even if I'm maybe not quite so sure. But generally speaking, I try to have a strong take on every issue when we do something like this. In this particular instance, though, when it comes to whatever it is that Antonio Cromartie's talking about on Twitter, being frustrated with the way in which some players are getting, I guess, frustrated with how they're being handled from an NIL basis compared to how others are, or Jimbo Fisher acknowledging that A&M is in the NIL age and they're going to try to leverage that to its advantage. The booster supposedly on message board who says it's some gigantic, huge 8-figure sum. Ross Bjork, the A&M athletic director, saying, no, that's ridiculous. We're not doing that. But nobody really willing to be all that specific on the record about what actually is happening here. I have to say, I find myself pretty confused by all of this. And I don't normally do this a lot this early in the show, but I actually kind of want to dive into some of your comments here on both Facebook and YouTube, whether you be an SEC West fan who pays attention to what A&M has done to build this number one recruiting class, or just a concerned college football fan about the direction all of this is going in the future. What do you make about the rumors that are out there about the role that name, image, likeness could have played in what's going on for Texas A&M? The fact that an A&M assistant is essentially complaining about it now on Twitter. This, to some people, feels like something they predicted. A&M's going to throw all this money around, but let's wait and see how happy those players are on the other side. Well, is this already evidence of that? Once again, I think it's very difficult to know, but it's going to be very easy for a lot of folks to connect the Cromartie rant to a lot of the other chatter that's been out there. Some of that denied directly by Bjork, the AD. Some of that hinted at a little bit by the comments from Jimbo Fisher going back to December. I just want to give you your chance to have your say on all of this about what this means for the future of the SEC. And is there anybody out there who maybe feels like they have a little better handle on specifically what is happening here, because I think for the most part, a lot of the NIL conversation that exists is actually pretty short on specifics for the most part. All right, so let's get some comments here. Bert Strickland says folks should play for the highest bidder, but the IRS going to have a field day with all the failed to be reported income. Yeah, I mean, and supposedly this is supposed to be one of the things that's going to be different, Bert, about the NIL world as comparison to the previous world, which we're not going to pretend that improper benefits haven't existed. We're not going to pretend that's not the case. We're also not going to, report on hearsay either when it comes to some of that kind of stuff. But we're not going to pretend that improper benefits, haven't existed in the past. And obviously, one of the potential benefits in the eyes of some is in NIL world, these transactions are on paper, whereas in the old days of, I don't know, casino chips or whatever else the thing was for an improper benefit, there was very little paper trail to follow and all that. But what I'm kind of curious about is if the NIL stuff is written down somewhere, then how come we don't get more tangible reporting about what players truly are getting paid? There was the rumor about Travis Hunter going to Jackson State. Oh, he's getting $2 million from Barstool. But then Deion Sanders denied that was true, and that story kind of gone away after that. If you go to like one of those websites like on3.com, they have supposed NIL valuations for certain players. Apparently, Bryce Young, the Alabama quarterback's worth $1.6 million. I have no doubt that he's worth a lot of money, but that doesn't mean he's gotten $1.6 million of cash in his hand. Spencer Rattler got 2 cars as a part of an endorsement deal with Oklahoma for his NIL, but I think people erroneously assume that means he owns those cars. In all likelihood, he was just given the chance to drive those cars. In other words, instead of getting $150,000 worth of value added to his net worth balance sheet, he actually probably got something in the neighborhood of about $20,000 worth of income because of the time in which he was able to drive the cars. It's a very different type of thing in reality to what it was necessarily reported to be. And I still kind of find it fascinating that obviously NIL is dominating the conversation around college football, yet when we have the conversation, we have it with so few verifiable specifics. David Johnson says college football is changing for the worse. Now it's going to be as fake as the NFL, which is a pretty strong take. And I have to admit that I'm a little bit like David in that I do get concerned with all the ways in which college football could be changing. And there are some ways in which it does seem like it's changing for the worse. Now, I'll also push back on that in the same breath by saying a lot of the things that we assume are going to be big changes and crazy new world actually ends up kind of receding in the background after a while. Let me give you an example of this. Do you remember around the period of, say, 2013, 2014, 2015? I forget exactly which year this was, but it was somewhere around that 13, 14, 15 time. That was the first time we were introduced to the concept of full cost of attendance. Do you remember this? This is when the NCAA made way for schools to give some money over and above a scholarship as a way of providing for what was known as the full cost of attendance. In other words, the scholarship doesn't quite pay for everything. We're going to give you more money to fill in the gaps where the scholarship falls a little bit short. And so schools had a little bit of discretion about how much money they gave. And do you remember how controversial it was that Auburn was going to give a full cost of attendance stipend that was, and I may get the number slightly wrong, some of y'all who are Auburn fans will remember this better than I do, it was like $8,500 or something like that. And, that was more than, like, say, UCLA, which was given like $4,000. And people were laughing about, the cost of attendance or the cost of living in Auburn, Alabama being higher than it is in Los Angeles. And people thought this was going to be some sort of improper benefit for Auburn and schools like that were maximizing the full cost of attendance stipend as a way of basically paying to get more players. But within a year, we never heard about that again. It just never really materialized to be much of an issue. And I almost wonder if the name, image, likeness thing doesn't end up kind of being the same kind of thing where, yeah, some player here and there may cash in on a big 7-figure deal or 6-figure deal. But for the most part, the average player is getting a few $100s at best, it would seem. But in order to truly know that, we need to know a little bit more, I would think, specifics about circumstances like what has happened to Texas A&M. Everybody wants to brag that they're a big shot if they're the one throwing the money around. But nobody ever seems to want to go back and validate that with facts, in other words. Emily Banks Buyer says, why is my scarf gold and black? So It's a fair question. So obviously, if I take the scarf off for a second, I do have my SEC country gear on. My other show that I do on a daily basis is called Dog Nation Daily. That is a UGA show. I am a UGA fan. So in Indianapolis for the national championship the other day, I got the national championship scarf. It was about 5 degrees in Indianapolis. They were giving out these scarves. And so since then, it's just a little bit of a souvenir. I've been wearing the scarf, but it's gold and black because that's the colors of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee. It's a very fair question. That's why. John Will says the follow-up to the story about Antonio Cromartie is going to be a former Texas A&M assistant. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, he tweeted this yesterday. I wondered if it'd get deleted or anything like that. It didn't. I mean, I don't think it's all that controversial what he says. In fact, a lot of what he says is probably true, that, if you are hiring a bunch of people to basically be your marketing company to go out and get these NIL deals. I mean, it's the same thing for people in broadcast media, things like that. You can go out and get an agent. A lot of folks like bragging about their agent, but that agent's taking a big, big skim off the top, and a lot of agents deserve that money. They work hard to earn it. But, it's the same thing in broadcast media there as well. Like what I do for a living. There are plenty of people who would love to represent you and be your agent, but they're going to want that, 5%, in some cases even 10%, off the top. And by the time you start getting, the big high-powered agent, pretty soon, all of a sudden, there's not quite as much for the food as for the kids on the table there. Let's do a couple more comments, and then we'll move on to the rest of the show. Esteban Esteves checks in. It's always great to see Esteban in the comment section. He says, I hate to throw that money for a kid looking for a payday instead of a kid trying to win a championship. Don't get me wrong, I'm for the players getting paid, but it needs to be basically a salary cap. And, I think what Esteban's kind of touching on here is, and this is where a lot of this is going, is, hey, how do you factor in the NIL world, the chance to kind of cash in on some of your worth, with also the just natural tendency that it seems to want to exist these days for kids bouncing out of a program pretty quick? In other words, if you're a booster of a school, are we paying a guy who's going to want to stick around here and help build this program up? Are we paying for a guy that's just simply not mature enough to make good on the promise that's implied with this monetary payment? I think that Esteban brings up a pretty fair point there. Let's do what else? A couple more comments here very quickly. Cody Taylor says, you're just mad Texas A&M has to do it to get top recruits because College Station. So Cody Taylor, no fan of Texas A&M there. Charles Carter also weighing in here there as well. I want to get Charles' comment. We'll move on. He says the $25 to $30 million thing is absolutely not true. It was started by a jealous rival. And I have a tendency to probably believe Charles on this, that there's really no tangible evidence anywhere that's true. I do find it fascinating that it's gotten as much traction as it's gotten, to the point where the A&M AD himself had to deny it. And, let me say this. If it was true, it's not scandalous. It's not illegal. So I guess my question would be, why deny it if it isn't true? Why deny it if it was true? It seems like you'd want to have the leverage of, hey, look how much money we're getting for our players. That if Bjork is denying it, he must be denying it because it truly isn't true. That's what I'm led to believe on that. But it is really amazing how much chatter something gets that nobody seems to be able to prove or not. And Cody Taylor says, I'm a dog BA. Cody, I do indeed. And I'm glad to have you in the part of this comment section here today. So Blake Morton also checks in to say, wonder what the deal is with Kamara Wheaton. We're going to get to the Kamara Wheaton thing here in a moment there as well. So we'll do a lot of your comments. We'll get into a lot of this on YouTube there as well, a little bit of Facebook stuff off the top, because honestly, this is one of those things where this is clearly a hot topic, but yet it's kind of hard to tell exactly where all this is going. So let me do one more thing in Texas A&M, then I'm going to get into some other stuff, including eventually arriving on the Kamara Wheaton thing there as well. It's a SEC Country Live here. We'll roll on. And apparently all the money in the world that some people allege that Texas A&M is spending on a regular basis here, not enough for linebacker Harold Perkins, who has recently decommitted from Texas A&M. We'll show you this on the screen. Perkins putting that out there, saying it's been one of the hardest decisions to make, but I'll be decommitting from Texas A&M and announce my decision February 2nd at my school. Now, a lot of folks seem to think that A&M is still a player in this, even though Perkins has decommitted. And the other schools that come up here, a couple within the SEC, LSU, which Perkins recently visited, Florida, which Perkins recently visited. So it sounds like that that A&M is still probably a player in Perkins. It was actually Perkins' commitment to A&M that allowed them to achieve the historic status of highest-rated recruiting class of all time. And now we'll find out on February 2nd if indeed Perkins does hold on to that pledge. I guess this turns into, for a lot of these guys that want to make their announcements in February, that's the final day. It's actually a week from today, the conclusion of the 2022 recruiting cycle. Maybe he just wants to add to the intrigue of the announcement that he's going to make, but a decommitment from Perkins, from Texas A&M to get more folks involved here, including the Floridas and the LSUs, that's going to continue to get a little bit of attention. I want to move on and talk about Auburn and a pretty interesting scenario for now second-year coach Bryan Harsin. Before that, though, let me remind you that this portion of the show is also brought to you in part by our friends at Meriwether and Tharp. They're your source for divorce around SEC country. That means that you can lean on them as a resource as you try to decide if divorce is the right thing for you. And you can go to their website, which is the AtlantaDivorceTeam.com. They're based in Atlanta, so am I. We're in the heart, what I think of as the capital of SEC country right here in Atlanta, Meriwether and Tharp just down the road from us. But you don't have to be in Atlanta to take advantage of what Meriwether and Tharp can do for you. You can check out their free resources, blog posts, podcasts, a chance to have an initial consultation with one of their attorneys, and find out that as you move into this new year, if it is truly time for you to maybe sever that relationship that's kind of, you kind of sort of see where this is going. Maybe it's time to take that next step. Meriwether and Tharp, the folks over there, can explain to you how the law can work to your benefit as you do that. Think about finances, think about children, think about all those things that are so important as a part of the divorce conversation. So please check them out online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. theatlantadivorceteam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for divorce around SEC country. All right, let's talk about Auburn here for a moment. Because I thought Adam Rittenberg had a pretty interesting piece up at ESPN.com last week about the idea that if you look around the landscape of the country, the coaches who are in the hot seat for this upcoming season, the coach that he has on the hot seat from the SEC is Harsin at Auburn. Now, we don't necessarily disagree with this. It seems like the writing's on the wall about this and has been now for a little bit of time. But it is still pretty remarkable how quickly all this has happened. And the events of last week, I think, make this even more of a conversation worth having. Speaking of Rittenberg also, I believe, the first to report today, a rumor that had been circulating last week is indeed true. The former Vanderbilt head coach, who had spent the last year as Auburn defensive coordinator Derek Mason, is being hired, and that is now done, as Oklahoma State's next defensive coordinator. What Rittenberg says is that it's a big-time hire for Mike Gundy in Oklahoma State after Jim Knowles' departure for Ohio State. It is a big win for Gundy and the Cowboys, and the kind of thing that I would say under normal circumstances should not happen in the SEC. It is just a given that SEC coordinators don't leave to go to a place like Oklahoma State. Over the course of years, there have been moments in which SEC schools have inquired about hiring Mike Gundy, but that's the way that goes. It's a step up to go from Stillwater, Oklahoma to anywhere in the SEC, certainly a place like Auburn, which has won a national championship, won an SEC, as recently as 2013, had a chance to win the SEC West, had a chance to be in the playoff in 2017. This program, under normal circumstances, should not be losing its defensive coordinator to Oklahoma State. And based on what I'm being told coming out of Auburn, it's not like Mason was asked to leave. It's not like he fell out of favor with Harsin necessarily. This seems to be a move of his own choosing, that he would rather be in Stillwater than Auburn right now, which further cements what Rittenberg wrote at ESPN.com, that as you move into year two, maybe Bryan Harsin just really is on the hot seat. Or maybe better said, maybe Harsin's kind of always been on the hot seat at Auburn. For a little historical perspective on this, let's go back to last August for a moment, when the SEC network was kicking around of the first-year SEC coaches who found themselves in the toughest position to start year one, whether it be Clark Lee at Vanderbilt or Shane Beamer, Josh Heupel, guys that we now know had very successful first seasons at South Carolina and Tennessee. Bryan Harsin's name was also in that conversation at the time. And in retrospect, he was nowhere near as successful as either Beamer or Heupel. And way back before the year began, SEC network analyst Matt Stinchcomb had really already zeroed in and identified Harsin as a coach who had a lot to prove in his rookie season in the league. This is what Matt Stinchcomb said on the SEC network.
It's Brian Harsin at Auburn, because the expectations there, they don't change. You're sharing a state with this program that's dominating college football, and at the same time, 2 out of the last 4 years, you beat Alabama. A couple of years ago, you're beating Georgia during the regular season, and then competing. You're Kerryon Johnson away from maybe winning the SEC championship in 2017. You're not that far removed. But what makes it even more difficult for Brian Harsin in year one is that you're coming off a 6-5 year that was a mirage. Those 6 wins, you could probably wipe clean 3 of those. When you think about the way they beat Kentucky, controversial to say the least. Arkansas, does it get more controversial?
Right.
Ole Miss, a couple of questionable instances in that game. So to me, there's almost like this false sense of reality of what Brian Harsin's walking into. I think he's got way more work to do than even the Auburn fan base realized.
I think it's a strong opinion from Matt Stinchcomb. I probably agree with the first part of that more so than the second, that actually – in retrospect, living up to the Gus Malzahn legacy at Auburn is actually not all that easy to do. You know, he did beat Alabama, the chief rival of Auburn, in 2013 and 2017, and again in 2019. That's not an easy thing to do. He even had a regular season win against Georgia in 2017, and that's like the only one of those that Auburn's had in, I don't know, decade, whatever else, that Gus Malzahn actually had a little bit more success at Auburn than some people have given him credit for. And, you know, being that for this fan base was never going to be easy for Harsin. Even though Malzahn's from Arkansas, he still seemed to have a little bit of an understanding of what the SEC culture was, maybe a little bit more than what Harsin had. And then for Brian Harsin, you had the early season situation where they almost lost to Georgia State. They lost a game at Penn State, in which some of Harsin's end-of-game decisions probably factored into that. Then way kind of almost out of nowhere, certainly very soon at the start of the season, Harsin made the controversial decision to fire his wide receivers coach, Cornelius Williams, during the year, essentially scapegoating him for the game that Auburn almost lost to Georgia State. Now, you may remember on SEC Country Live at the time, we went back and played some audio for you of former Auburn offensive coordinator Tony Franklin, whose time with Auburn predated Harsin's, but knew Williams personally and really took Harsin to task for that decision to fire Cornelius Williams as an idea of just how disconnected Harsin may be from the larger Auburn community overall. Tony Franklin's words, the former Tigers offensive coordinator after the Williams firing, maybe they demonstrate that about as well as anybody could. Once again, this is the former Auburn OC on Brian Harsin, not exactly making a lot of friends in his early days as Auburn coach.
So 4 games in, you crack and you fire your receiver coach. I do know a little bit about football, maybe not a lot, but I know a little bit. I have been around, and I've done some stuff. And here's what I'll tell you that I see. The best coached group on the field for offense was your receivers. They were the best coached group. So you're basically firing your receiver coach because your offensive line sucks.
So that's a pretty strong take from Tony Franklin. Yeah, he knows Williams personally, as we said at the time. Maybe he does have an axe to grind here. In fact, in that podcast discussion, he even admitted that, yeah, he kind of does have a little bit of an ulterior motive for supporting Cornelius Williams, but it doesn't mean that his words didn't accurately reflect a portion of the Auburn fan base, where you just sort of get the sense that Auburn fans are just a little bit lukewarm about Harsin all the way around, especially compared to South Carolina fans who've really bought into Shane Beamer, or Tennessee fans who I think now have really bought into Josh Heupel. You know, Brian Harsin's not enjoying that kind of honeymoon right now at all. In fact, I actually spent some time on an Auburn message board today just because I did want to see what fans were saying about this. And maybe I should have expected this because they are the number 1 team in the country right now, but it's really amazing how little talk the football team is generating really whatsoever. Go to an Auburn message board if you travel in any of those. It's all about Bruce Pearl. In fact, maybe Bruce Pearl's going to be on the radar for the Louisville job. I don't even know how real that is, but that's out there. But also just the fact that Auburn's winning games of basketball right now and won again, last night as the number 1 team in the country. That's what's getting a lot of attention right now. And listen, that's great. I love SEC basketball. I'm happy to see, an Auburn team like that getting some attention with its fans. They've obviously got a, relatively new, beautiful arena. So they're having fun with all of that. But if I'm an Auburn football stakeholder, this is making me pretty concerned right now that there's really no time of the year, I don't care how good the other sports are, where the football team in SEC country is supposed to be off the radar. But right now, the Auburn football team has been completely pushed off the radar by the success of the basketball program. Very little recruiting buzz. You've got a door of assistants leaving, Mike Bobo, Derek Mason. You've got guys coming in who you don't really quite know what to make of them. Jimmy Brumbaugh, speaking of being fired in the season, he was once fired during the year at Tennessee. I mostly blame Jeremy Pruitt for that, but it's not like his arrival at Auburn is going to be, he's not going to be greeted as a liberator necessarily. Christian Robinson come over from Florida. That's probably a pretty good hire. But once again, there's just very little buzz existing around the Auburn program at the moment. And I think that speaks to the issues that Brian Harsin has as much as anything else, that Auburn is a fan base that you think of as quite energized. I would put Jordan-Hare Stadium among the loudest in the entire SEC. When Joe Burrow, the Cincinnati Bengals quarterback this week, said playing in SEC stadiums has prepared him for whatever he's going to face this Sunday at Arrowhead for the AFC title game, one of the first stadiums that I thought about when Burrow said that was Jordan-Hare because of how loud that it can be. That's how energized we typically think of the Auburn fan base as being. But what I'm seeing right now is a fan base that's a lot more lackadaisical than that, and I blame Brian Harsin for that lack of energy around the Auburn program. I'll get more SEC news coming up, including a little bit of a difference of opinions from a couple of former UGA greats. We'll do that here coming up in a moment. Let me also get a few of your YouTube comments, and then I'll do a little bit more as well on the two conference title games here in a moment there too. So let's do some YouTube comments for a moment. Darian Ford checks in to say, just a reminder that the Georgia Bulldogs, your 2021 national champs. If you're a Georgia fan, that's always a great thing to be able to hear. Let's see what else. So G. Grace Bama Boy, who's a great commenter, big Alabama fan, asked an interesting question. This goes back to the top of the show from a little earlier. He says, why else would 24 top recruits go to Texas A&M other than NIL? He says that's the only reason why. They're not a winning program like Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, or Georgia. So I think that G. Gray is actually a little unfair here. And this is the point that Ross Bjork had made in the Houston Chronicle story the other day, is that it's not like A&M went from 24th to 1st. A&M has been top 10 now. How many years in a row? Let me see if I can find. Let's see if I can quickly find this. So let me see if I can find these numbers. I may not be able to find this quick, but if you look at their recent recruiting class, okay. So before Jimbo Fisher, they had not had more than 2 consecutive top 10 classes in any year prior to Jimbo Fisher, but they've now had 4 straight. They were 4th in 2019, 6th in 2020, they're 8th in 2021, and now 1st in 2022. So, the notion that the only way A&M could put a big class together is through NIL, the previous 3 years don't exactly suggest that. If you're 4th and 6th in the last 2 years, forget the fact that they were, whatever, but, 4th in 19, 6th in 20, 8th in 2021, you're within shouting distance of the number 1 class anyway. It's a talent-rich state, so I kind of reject G. Grace's comment that the only way A&M could put the number 1 class together is through, those means. When Georgia first got into number 1 under Kirby Smart in 2018, at that point in time, they hadn't really won anything either. That, sometimes you do just sort of step up and take the title away. Georgia did that once, and now Texas A&M's done that too. Now, I'm not going to say that there's no NIL money going around, but I simply don't believe the $25-30 million. I just don't. William Perry on the subject of the taxes thing when it comes to the players. Listen, it's still better to get the money than not. That is definitely true. That's going back to what Antonio Cromartie said earlier about. So the taxes you can't do anything about. That's just the law. You can't do anything about that. And you still want the money even if it's taxed. But his point about the way in which some of these marketing companies are kind of operating, that's probably not worth that's probably worth at least considering the possibility of. Bo Molinari checking in on YouTube, who is an A&M fan, who says, I'm sure that the Aggie former students dug deep. Looks like the Aggies didn't pay that linebacker recruit enough, though, mentioning Harold Perkins. And he says A&M's just not giving its competitors anything to leverage. Maybe that's the case, but privately you got to think if you're more willing to do this, because there are some programs who are just more willing to do this than others are. When Billy Napier first took the Florida job, one of the things that he mentioned in an introductory press conference is they wanted to have some infrastructure within the program to help players with NIL. There are a lot of SEC coaches that haven't gone quite so far as to say that, although I'm sure that they're basically all doing the same thing. In this particular case, Billy Napier was a little bit more outspoken about it than some other programs have been. So if I would say that if what is true, that A&M's really throwing that kind of money around, they'd want it known so they could get more recruits that way, have at least more recruits interested in taking visits because they think they're going to pay and get cashed in. Now, maybe the downside of that is what Antonio Cromartie was saying earlier is all of a sudden now you got players worried about what other players are making. I said the same thing about that Miami guy the other day. He was like, hey, I'm giving this guy $42,000. I'm giving this guy $36,000. I'm giving this guy $50,000. I realize it's all free market economy and everybody negotiates their own deal. But if you're the guy getting 36 sitting next to the guy that gets 42, I'm sure there is probably a little human nature to wonder how come he's getting $6,000 more than me, unless there's some specific reason why that's the case. Foster Moss. I had a little subtle jab there earlier, and Foster caught that. I appreciate that. Darian Ford said I was late. I wasn't that late starting this show today. We started at 3 o'clock, didn't we? I'm late a lot, but today we were on time, weren't we? You may have just been early. Darian. Bo Molinari says A&M is where UGA was 2 years ago on the cusp of greatness. Now, Bo, in the case of Georgia, admittedly, I'm proud of this fact. Georgia did cash in its recruiting success and result in the form of a national championship. Now, listen, Bo, if you want to go back to the beginning of the year, and not just to Bo here, but all of our A&M fans who are watching and listening, I really spoke up big for Texas A&M. I thought Texas A&M was going to go 11-1, and I thought they'd be a fringe playoff contender, not winning the SEC West, but going 11-1. As it turns out, they beat Alabama, something I didn't think it was going to do. But then they end up losing a bunch of other games there as well. And I get quarterback injury and I get all that kind of stuff. But I do find it to be fascinating if A&M can follow up the recruiting success with the on-field success. It is going to be a big year for Jimbo Fisher. Now, I think Jimbo's a pretty good coach. I think he's building a pretty good program there at Texas A&M. Bo, I'm probably more likely to agree with you than not. But listen, not everybody else is willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on that right now. This is a show-me-something year for Jimbo Fisher for a lot of people, and that's going to be a big topic here during the offseason. All right, I want to do some Georgia stuff in a moment, speaking of the Dogs. Before that, though, let me remind you about my friends at BetUS, America's most beloved sportsbook. You don't get to be that way unless you're taking really good care of the players who are showing up to be a part of your sportsbook each and every day, and that's what they've been doing for more than 25 years, including you when you sign up for the very first time. That means you use the promo code SEC125. It's betus.com, promo code SEC125. And when you do, you're going to get a 125% bonus on your initial deposit. That means, let's just use simple math here for a moment. You put in $100, they are going to put in $125. You're going to have $225. Just a simple example of how it can work out for you. They're putting in more money than you are. That means you're already a winner before you even place and make and win your first bet. You're just set up with BetUS there that way. And as you head towards the weekend, I would say that one of the most fun betting days on the entire calendar, AFC, NFC championship game, whether you're getting involved in the props, the over-under, the side, you want a money line, you got all of that this weekend. And I say it's always more fun to watch these games when you've got a little bit of action down on what the outcome is going to be. So betus.com, promo code SEC125 to take advantage of that. All right, so we had a commenter in our Facebook comment section a little earlier talk about the way in which he feels like college football is changing for the worse. And there are some frustrations that creep in. I try to have a positive mindset about things like this, but even me, admittedly, I'm a traditionalist. When tradition is threatened, I'm suspicious of those who want to threaten it. I totally acknowledge all of that. And if you yourself find yourself wrestling with some of the scenarios that exist in college football right now, maybe take some comfort that you're not the only one who feels that way. Let's look at a situation for Georgia here for a moment, where this week it was announced that a Georgia wide receiver, Jermaine Burton, is leaving Georgia to go to Alabama. Now, that's Burton on your screen right there, giving you the hashtag RTR. I can promise you that the Georgia fans I speak to on a daily basis, they don't love seeing that hashtag, that phrase, coming from a guy that had just helped Georgia beat Alabama for a national championship. Now he wants to run off and be on the losing team. For a lot of Georgia fans, that's problematic. And it creates a debate amongst a lot of folks in college football of how much of this transfer portal stuff is okay for the sport. And Is it weird when a guy like Burton leaves Georgia, goes to Alabama, and now next year he's going to be playing for the other team against the team that he had just got a national championship ring with? Well, it's not just people like you and me who are debating this kind of thing. Former Georgia players debating this there as well. You had Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver McCole Hardman squaring off against Green Bay Packers defensive back Eric Stokes, both of them former Dogs this week, and both of them sharing a little bit different opinion about what's truly going on here with Jermaine Burton. Let me show you McCole Hardman here at first. He put this on Instagram. He says, how are you going to go to the team we just beat and leave a team you just won the national championship with? That was the frustration that McCole Hardman shared about this, about Jermaine Burton. To someone like Hardman, this just seems really weird. However, in the case of Stokes, who also played defensive back at Georgia, now plays for the Packers, apparently it doesn't seem quite so weird to him because 24/7 Sports wrote a story about Hardman's Instagram post, and then Stokes had a response to that. First of all, this is Jermaine Burton saying of his decision, why does it matter who agrees with me? It's my career. It's nobody else's. So that's Jermaine Burton essentially saying it's my choice to do whatever I want to do. But Eric Stokes says that he basically agrees with Burton on that he's doing something that he thinks is best for his career. So why should you be worried about somebody else's? He says stay in your lane. Now, it's not clear if Stokes is telling Hardman to stay in his lane or telling 24/7 Sports to stay in its lane, or it could just be something that he's saying. But this is why I think that we should all at least be paying attention to this, is that minor league sports are not popular. NBA G League, nobody cares about it. Minor league baseball, fewer teams now by the hundreds than there were a couple of years ago. USFL and all these spring football leagues that have tried to get started up, none of them survive. None of them last. That minor league sports just are not popular. And college football has always been something other than a minor league sport. In fact, if you want to go back a century ago, college football was actually more popular than the NFL. That it's not always been the case that the NFL was more popular than college football. That's certainly true now, but if you want to go back to the time of, like, say, Teddy Roosevelt and things like that, college football is actually more popular than the NFL. That college football has always had an existence that's about more than just a feeder system for the NFL. So a lot of people look at Burton and say, well, of course he would leave Georgia to go to Alabama. Admittedly, receivers put up bigger numbers in that program, and possibly those bigger and better numbers allow him to have a better NFL career, that it just makes sense to a lot of people, and that may be the case. But there are a lot of us that don't want college football. Even if you're not a Georgia fan like I am, there are a lot of people who don't want college football to be simply a feeder system for the NFL, and we don't want to view college football players as nothing more than vessels of NFL potential. That's just not the way we see college football. As trite and as cliche as it sounds, in college football, the name on the front of the jersey truly is more important than the name on the back of the jersey. That's why college football is so popular, because people either went to a school or they live in that state and they have a connection to that that's more than, hey, let's find out what draft grade this guy gets at the end of the season. That's just, college football's always stood for more than that. So in this particular case, some of the frustrations that exist about Burton's decision are related to, we want to think of these players as more than just future NFL draft picks. And as I've said before, I'm also kind of from the Michael Jordan era. As a child in the 80s, high schooler in the 90s, back then, you didn't like your opponent. Michael Jordan treated his foes as enemies. Even if you weren't alive during the Jordan time, or if you're too young to remember that, you've probably seen The Last Dance. You see how Jordan treated his competitors. And there are a lot of Georgia fans that want to view Alabama the same way. Frankly, there are a lot of Alabama fans that want to view Georgia the same way. And Tennessee fans that want to think about Florida that way, and LSU fans want to think about Auburn that way, or just whatever cross-section of battle you're talking about here. That's the way in which fans want to think about their favorite school and want to think about their favorite school's rivals. That there's not going to be universal acceptance of, well, you played for this team this year and you go over, you play for the other team next year. That's okay. We just hope both teams have fun. That's not the way most people are going to view SEC football. So interesting to see the way in which Stokes and Hardman square off on this, and interesting to think about the way in which that also reflects the larger conversation happening amongst some fans as well. Now, it is fair to point out that the transfer portal sometimes giveth, in the case of Jermaine Burton, to Tuscaloosa, and sometimes it takes away in the person of Kamar Wheaton, former 5-star running back, who I guess a lot of Alabama fans sort of feel like, wait, we never saw this guy at all. They have no idea what kind of player he could have been in Tuscaloosa. Apparently, they'll never get to find out either. Speaking of 24/7 Sports, I mentioned them a moment ago. One of their reporters, Chris Hummer, reporting yesterday that running back Kamar Wheaton, 5-star from the 2021 class, no longer listed in Alabama's student directory and has been away from the team. So apparently this is all real and true, and Wheaton's just leaving. Now, Alabama's also bringing in Jahmyr Gibbs, former Georgia Tech running backs. From that standpoint, if it truly is a trade of an inexperienced running back for an experienced and successful running back like Gibbs, then it's probably a net positive for the Crimson Tide. But it is still a little bit weird to think about a guy like Wheaton coming in with a lot of fanfare. You talk about historic recruiting class. You know, the A&M class is getting that treatment now, but it was really the Alabama class that also got a lot of that treatment going back to the previous cycle. Wheaton's late addition there was a big part of that, and yet ultimately never really materializes there in Tuscaloosa. And, you know, for those of us who like SEC teams, I cheer for Georgia, you cheer for whoever, you know, there's always going to be a pretty steady pipeline of 5-star recruits flowing into the programs that we care about in this league. But it's also fair to point out that while it's still better to have 5 stars than not, and very high 4 stars than not, the batting average on who does truly hit for your program is always going to be about 50-50. That's just kind of the way that works out. And unfortunately for Alabama fans, apparently Wheaton, there in the Crimson Tide uniform, finds himself on the other side of that 50. All right, a few more comments here. We'll take those on both Facebook and YouTube, and we'll give you kind of a funny SEC LOL to roll out of here. One of the things we haven't heard from a lot today are Florida fans. If there are some Florida fans in the comment section, wouldn't mind hearing from you. Tell me how you feel about what Billy Napier's doing to put that staff together and some of the, I guess, recent recruiting stories there. You know, one of the things that, and I'm a couple hundred miles away, and so you can tell me differently on this, but boy, it seems like Napier didn't exactly, some of the guys that maybe Dan Mullen was close to signing, it seems like Napier didn't really show them a lot of attention. They go elsewhere. And now some of the ways in which Napier's filling in some of the holes with that 2022 class are transfer-type players, in some cases guys that were with him in his Louisiana Lafayette program. It seems like in some cases, had Napier done more just to hold on to the class that Mullen had, that actually be a higher overall level of talent right now. If you're a Florida fan, maybe you can tell me, maybe you have an opinion on that. Gary Lawn says, when it comes to the SEC states and online betting, that's why I love the idea of BetUS. Very simple. Just go right there. You get all your action down with BetUS, betus.com for more on that. Deontay Julian says he's a Florida fan. He's been here all day. He says Napier's making moves. We're on the way up. Scared money? Don't make money. So Deontay feeling pretty good about Billy Napier right now there at Florida. It's going to be a very interesting year in the SEC East. You've got guys like Beamer and Heupel trying to build on year one success. And frankly, I thought both guys did a great job this past year. I also think it's not as easy to do better in year two as maybe some Vols and Gamecocks fans want it to be. But because they did have that year one success, they do have a little bit of a head start on Florida right now. Georgia is the reigning national champion. Kentucky very quietly won 10 games this year. So, you know, for Billy Napier trying to build his program up in the SEC, right, in the SEC East, right now you've got a few other programs that are pretty firmly established and others that are on their way up themselves. And so Napier's going to have to do a lot quickly just to even hold off the momentum that seems to be growing for some other teams within the division. Antonio Freeman says Billy is building a good thing from 72nd to 26th in the recruiting rankings, and the portal is going to be our best friend. He says, go Gators, so feeling pretty good as well. Deontay Julian says Mullen was horrible, so I don't blame Napier for looking past what Mullen did. So Florida fans feeling pretty good here. Blake Morton also says, Bama's going undefeated, winning it all this year, mark my words. Well, here's the one thing we can say without much debate, that the best returning offensive and defensive player in the SEC both reside at Alabama, I believe. Now, that's on paper to begin the year. Could someone like Jalen Carter overtake Will Anderson by the end of the year? Possibly so. Other names you can have in that discussion there too. But on paper, to begin the year, the best returning offensive player is the Heisman Trophy winner, Bryce Young. Best returning defensive player is Will Anderson, had he get a chance to be drafted right now, he'd be drafted very highly. So on paper, they got the best guy on both sides of the ball coming back. Here's the problem I have with Alabama right now, though. And they're going to start the year preseason number one. That's true. But what concerns me a bit is a lot of Alabama fans will say, well, if John Mechie hadn't gotten hurt, if Jamison Williams hadn't gotten hurt, Alabama would have won the national championship this year. And that's a hypothetical thing we can never truly know the answer to. I don't think it's quite as easy to assume as some Bama fans want it to. But this is where Alabama's just different than it once was. No doubt great quarterback play. Bryce Young may be the best of them all. I would actually probably rank the quarterbacks in ascending order. Tua better than Jalen Hurts, Mac Jones better than Tua, and now Bryce Young possibly eventually viewed as the best of them all. So you're going to have great quarterback play. And now over and over, Alabama has replicated really high-level wide receiver play. But the defense is not what it once was. Running game, not what it once was. Now, maybe Jahmyr Gibbs helps change that, but Alabama having to go to Georgia Tech to find a transfer running back to get the running game that it needs, that would concern me a little bit if I was an Alabama fan. That when you put the entire hopes of your program on players like Young, players like Jamison Williams, players like John Mechie, these are guys who are small in stature. By nature, quarterbacks are just thinner, more frail than linebackers, linemen, running backs, defensive edge rushers. It's just a more frail position group. They are more prone to injury in a violent game like what exists here in the SEC. In other words, I think Alabama is still unquestionably in the elite category of team, but I have to say that elite status is more fragile than it used to be. When your entirety of your national championship resume consists of quarterbacks throwing to wide receivers, position groups that are prone to injury, I just think you're talking about a program there that's just more fragile than it used to be. And that's the reason I believe they lost to Georgia in the national championship. Let's get a couple more. James Gatlin says, no, BA, didn't you hear? They're starting their dynasty run this year. So basically kind of having some fun there with the Alabama thing. Ken Stapleton asked a good question. How long before LSU gets back on track? I think a lot of that comes down to transfer portal quarterback, doesn't it? Because we know that Max Johnson is gone, and there had been some chatter that, well, maybe Caleb Williams is going to LSU. But my gosh, it seems like now Caleb Williams is just kind of going anywhere. Like the rumors about Williams, the former Oklahoma quarterback, most people seem to think he's going to likely land at USC. I have no reason to dispute that. You had this bizarre Wisconsin rumor that kind of emerged out of nowhere. LSU at one point in time was thought to be a player. But a lot of what Brian Kelly can do quickly at LSU is going to depend on, are they able to utilize the transfer portal to get that quarterback that we see at LSU, we've seen before. Transfer quarterback comes in, everything changes. Obviously, Joe Burrow maybe put together the greatest single season in college football history is what he did in 2019. But as of right now, man, it is a long way away from knowing what the LSU roster exactly is going to look like. I mean, the thing about Scott Woodward has been, when he's had a chance to make high-profile hires, that's what he's done. He's hired the big name. Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M, Kim Mulkey, the basketball coach a couple of years ago. Spin big, hire the most famous coach available. And I think that's actually a fairly intelligent strategy from the standpoint of there's a array of likely outcomes. And if you can, as a decision maker, as a hirer, as a person who makes the hire, if you can take unmitigated disaster off the table, of course you'd want to do that. If you can, look at the array of possibilities and say, we're going to eliminate disaster from the equation, then of course the money you spend to do that is worth the investment, the return you get being greater than that. So hiring a guy like Brian Kelly took disaster off the table. LSU needs to button some things up, and it couldn't afford to have a failed head coach doing that. Brian Kelly will not be a failure at LSU. He's too good of a coach. We know that. Can he be as good as Tigers fans want him to be? Can he compete with what Nick Saban is in the SEC West? What A&M fans believe Jimbo Fisher is going to be at Texas A&M? Well, that remains to be seen. But the one thing you have going for you is a successful enough coach, a couple of trips to the college football playoff, fixture in the top 10, no stranger to recruiting wins. You know you've got a coach who's at least competent, who's at least going to start knowing that he's going to be something better than a failure, and we'll find out how much better he gets after that. A couple of final YouTube comments, and we'll kind of roll out of here for today. Some of y'all on YouTube, man, I just never know. I just never know what y'all are going to be doing. For sure. G. Grace Bama Boy says that winning a title, and there's a little bit of luck involved. That's true. Sacred Grove says that Jahmyr Gibbs is not your typical Tech running back. I do agree with that. Very good player. No disputing that. But if you're Alabama, man, it's, you want to see those guys being developed, and whether it be Wheaton leaving the program, Trey Sanders, for the most part, just a guy right now, not really a factor. It's kind of a weird thing. And G. Grace Bama Boy says that Bama also needs some of that luck from a health standpoint. That's true. And listen, I don't make a big deal about injuries. There are some people who want to blame this, that, and the other for injury. Frankly, Nick Saban's done that some. I didn't like it when he did that. But for the most part, injuries are bad luck. We've said that now a million times, that a lot of fans want to make some sort of villain out of somebody when somebody gets hurt, strength and conditioning coach, whatever else. For the most part, we just believe that injuries are bad luck. Alabama's had a lot of them, but we don't blame Clark Lee, or what's the guy's name? Lee, what's the strength and conditioning coach name? Or Nick Saban. We don't really blame anybody for those injuries. All right, a couple more comments. Sacred Grove also says, if I'm Caleb and I can't take Stetson Bennett, the fourth job, then I rethink my career path. Yeah, I don't know that Caleb Williams is coming to Georgia, but he's going somewhere, I guess. G. Grace Bama Boy said, talking about Wheaton's ACL. Yeah, he was injured this year, but still, to be just exiting out of the program this quickly, that's one of those. Yeah, that's one of those things that's a little odd. I don't necessarily blame Alabama for that, but you've had a handful of running backs who've kind of come in, and they haven't all quite progressed the way that you'd want them to be. Darian Ford said, Florida's crying Jordan tears, singing Everybody Hurts. That's really funny there as well. Always great comments in the comment section of both Facebook and YouTube. Always appreciate all of that. Also, we like to close out our show here on a little bit of a lighthearted note. It's always kind of fun to kind of go out on kind of a happy note. We had to stretch a little bit to find one here this week. Not as much funny stuff has happened, I guess, for whatever reason. But if you want to go back to the weekend when the NFL playoffs occurred, first of all, best division round we've probably ever seen. The Chiefs-Bills game on Sunday night may be the best, certainly NFL playoff game, if not NFL game all the way around. It's as good as anything I've seen before. And obviously a weekend like that gets a lot of folks talking. One of the things that folks got noticed was the fact that former Georgia quarterback Matthew Stafford took down Tom Brady, and the SEC network says it's Georgia beating Michigan again. Of course, you'll remember Brady is a former Wolverine. You see the smile on Matt Stafford's face, and you see Georgia there with the Oranges celebrating that Orange Bowl win against the Michigan Wolverines. I always like when the SEC network does something fun and clever like that, so we'll give them a little bit of credit for that. We will say that is your SEC LOL for today. Next week is traditional, old-school National Signing Day, so a lot of recruiting on next week's program. We will see you Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time for SEC Country Live on Facebook, on YouTube. Look forward to speaking to you then, everybody.